This is how you install a regulator on a Barra 1100Z. The first thing that you want to make sure you do is make sure that the gun is degassed. To do that, you'll remove the fill cap. With your gun, you should have gotten a degassing screw as well as a hex key that will go with that. We're going to insert that and thread it in. And then basically you'll snug it down until you hear hissing of air. If your gun has gas in it, you should start hearing air leaking out. Once you hear the air starting to leak out, just leave it be until you no longer hear hissing. To verify that your gun is indeed empty, go ahead and cock your gun, point it into a safe backstop, and dry fire. You shouldn't hear any gas coming out of the barrel. Once you've done that, you know the gun is safe to work on. I would recommend going ahead and pulling out that screw. I've filled a gun far too many times with that screw left in there. And of course, as soon as you pull off your pump or try to let the air out of your hose, all of the air bleeds through the bleed screw. So go ahead and take that out. We've now made sure that the gun is safe to work on. The next thing that we need to do is take a 2mm hex key and loosen the shroud screw that's on the top of the barrel band. You don't have to completely remove it, just make sure it's standing proud of that surface. And we can now unscrew the shroud. And it should slide right out. Pay attention to make sure that your air stripper is present. If it isn't, it's probably stuck in here. Make sure that you push that out and set it to the side. We don't need to remove it for what we're doing here, so we're going to move on. Go ahead and open your side lever, and you'll notice you've got a Phillips head screw here and a flat head screw there. Those both need to be removed. Be sure to use a properly fitting screwdriver for this. If your screwdriver doesn't fit well, you'll end up marring the heads of these screws. And then you can just carefully back this out. So now you've got your breech and barrel here. We can go ahead and dry fire to release the hammer. The next thing that you'll want to do is place the safety on the safe position by pulling it back. We're then going to use a punch and a soft face hammer to drive the safety out. So just place it square over that, and it should just punch right out. Now we have our safety. We'll set it off to the side. Keeping the gun upside down, the next thing that we'll need is a 4mm hex key to remove this front screw. And then we'll need a 5mm hex key to remove this rear screw. Goodness, it's long. And now your action should slide out of the stock. So now we can move on to the next step. We can remove the barrel band. We can then take a flathead screwdriver and loosen this forward screw in the trigger pack. And then we can use a Phillips screwdriver to remove the rear screw. We'll set our trigger pack to the side. The next thing that we need to do is remove the hammer pin. So we can push the hammer screw adjuster, take out the hammer spring, and then unscrew the pin. And remove the hammer. The next thing you'll need is a pair or a wrench, or in this case I have some channel lock pliers, and we need to remove the pressure gauge. They're usually not too tight, so just get it started with the wrench and take it off by hand. Set that off to the side. You also need to remove this stud here. Again, that's a less than ideal tool, but it's what I have today. So we'll set that to the side. We'll slide out the spacer next. Sometimes this doesn't come out easily, and we can save this for a later step. I'll mention that when we get there. Now that we have that off, let's go ahead and take off the fill assembly. And then we'll take that off, set it to the side. We've almost fully disassembled the gun. You'll notice we have these 3 screws that hold the valve in. We'll need a 3mm hex key, and we'll unscrew each of those. To get the valve and the pressure gauge, as well as if your spacer was stuck inside the tube, you'll need some sort of tool. You can use a dowel rod. I find a piece of 1/2-inch CPVC pipe works better. You can also use a 1/2-inch black poly pipe. Basically anything that will fit down through here and have some wiggle room. So we're actually going to go ahead and push everything out through the side that the fill assembly was in. We do that because there's a lot of different slots that oftentimes could use some deburring, and so if we push it out the shorter end, we end up tearing up all of our O-rings. So I'm going to go ahead and sometimes you just got to kind of pop it just a little bit just to break those O-rings loose. We'll wiggle out the gauge block. Give it a little persuasion if it needs it. And the last thing will be the valve and possibly that spacer if it didn't just slide out on you earlier. And now we have fully disassembled our air tube. All right, so let's discuss the regulator. So now that we have all the parts out of the gun, you'll see we have this slot on the gauge block. So what we end up having to do, that slot is normally facing toward the fill assembly, but the regulator needs to seal against that surface. And so what we're going to have to do is rotate the pressure gauge block 180 degrees. You also need to make sure that the face of it is relatively clean and free of any major gouges. So the pressure gauge block mates up against the pressure regulator. And you'll see you have this little hole here. The pressure regulator actually has to breathe. And to make that breathing possible, we have to remove these 2 O-rings on this flat side. So I'm going to use a pick to do that. This modification is completely reversible. If you ever decide that you don't want to have a regulated gun anymore, you'll just have to replace these 2 O-rings. Take care that you don't scratch up the gland surfaces. So just very gently get in there and remove the O-rings. Now that the O-rings are removed, you can see that this surface will seal, but there's nothing that prevents the air from breathing. So this is the first step in setting up your gun for regulation. The next thing that you need to do is locate your spacer. And this is pretty much how things work. The spacer goes between the gauge block and valve, because now you're going to have all that pressure pushing on the gauge block, and you don't want the pressure gauge stem itself taking all of that pressure. So we install this spacer in here, and now everything is pressing up against the valve screws like it was designed to do. So this is kind of an internal view of how the regulator is set up. You have your valve spacer, you've got your gauge block with 2 of the O-rings, the flat face, facing the regulator. You will notice that this is maybe less than optimal. When you do install the regulator, you are going to drop power. In 177, you should still get pretty good power. In 22, it's going to be a little anemic. You're looking at, for best experience, probably 18 foot-pounds. You can definitely get higher, but your shot count is going to suffer. If you have a lathe, you can remove these 2 O-ring glands. You can remove one of them on this side, install a longer spacer. There's a lot of different things that you can do to open up space in there to get more power if you have access to the proper tools. So let's go ahead and start reassembling things. The first thing that you want to do is look at all of your O-rings. Make sure that they're free of any fuzz or anything that might be on your work surface. Also make sure that none of your O-rings are nicked. The next thing that you want to do is make sure you get just a little bit of silicone grease on this O-ring. My fingers are covered in that grease from disassembling this rifle, so I'm just going to apply some of that excess lubricant to that O-ring as well as the one that's on the body here. Make sure you don't use any petroleum-based lubricants. It's got to be silicone-based. The next thing that we need to do is to think about the layout of our gun. You see here that we have the port that the gauge will install through. We want to make sure that the outlet of the valve is directly opposite of that. So it's going to have to point up. So we're going to go ahead and just get that started. Just wiggle it gently past those threads. If you go really rough here, you're probably going to tear up your O-rings. So once you get past those threads, it should knock in there pretty well. So now we'll take that piece of pipe and we will push the valve down into the gun. Be careful as you're going across here where the pressure gauge port is. Again, that's another potential area you could chew up those O-rings and end up with a leaking gun. Just gently push that back. Until you have access to the screws here. I'm going to have to tap it forward just a little bit. Sometimes you have to fiddle around with it to get it to go just right. That's close enough. Once you've gotten everything lined up, make sure that the valve outlet is positioned in the opposite direction as the gauge. Make sure that all your screw holes are lined up. Go ahead and take a look in there and make sure that you don't see any black pieces of O-ring. If you see black pieces of O-ring, that probably means you're going to need to replace those O-rings if you had to place them back and forth trying to get that positioned. Once you've done that, let's go ahead and put in our valve securing screws. So again, we need the 3mm hex key for that. You want to make sure that those screws are sitting against the valve and that they're fully inside of those holes. Once you got the valve securing screws in, you'll need to place your spacer inside. Make sure they're worked past those threads. Again, inspect the O-rings on your gauge block. Make sure that the slot now is facing opposite of the way that you originally pulled it out of the gun, so the slot needs to be facing the valve now. You also want to make sure that these threads are lined up with the gauge port. So we're going to go ahead and get that gently started past the threads. Take one last look and make sure that the threads are pointing up. Just get it started and we'll drive it in with our pipe. Sometimes it'll be slightly out of alignment, so you can just get your finger in there. Now you can go ahead and install the pressure gauge. We'll go finger tight, and then we'll take a wrench, or in my case these channel locks, and basically just cinch it up a little bit, maybe a quarter of a turn. Now that we've done that, we can install the regulator. These are made with pretty tight tolerances, so just be careful as you're pushing it through. There's not a lot of wiggle. All right, we're past the threads. You want to make sure that you push it all the way home. Give it a couple taps to make sure it's there. So now we've got the regulator installed. We can install the fill assembly. This just needs to be bottomed out. It doesn't have to be torqued down. Next thing that we need to do is we need to install our spacer. Make sure that the screw holes are pointing up and down. This can be a slightly tricky step sometimes. Want to push it right to that hole. Then we'll take the stud and get that started in there. Give it just a slight tightening, don't overdo this one. The next thing that we can do is install our hammer. The hole in the hammer should point up. We're going to push that in until it's accessed through that slot, and then we'll put the pin in. Give it just a slight touch up with the screwdriver. Make sure it's in there well. We can install the hammer spring. Make sure that it slips over the guide. Then we can install the hammer spring adjuster. It's sometimes easier when you're assembling this to go ahead and just back it out until it's flush with the rear, like this. Make sure that we have the hole that's closer pointing up, closer to the end. You'll see that this one's further from the end. Have the one that's closest pointing up. Make sure that it goes into the hole inside that. There should be no spring pressure when configured this way. Let's go ahead and turn this upside down. We'll get our trigger pack. So we'll install the Phillips back here and the flathead toward the front. I normally just tighten these by hand. Be careful with the flathead one. There's not a lot of clearance there. Don't over tighten it, just make sure it's snug. This back one here, again, just make sure it's snug, don't overdo things. The next thing that we'll do is go ahead and slip in our barrel band. There is a nut that's back here, make sure you haven't lost it. And we'll get this all positioned to install into the stock. There's a little cutout up here that allows the barrel band to slip in. The next thing we'll do is we'll take the larger stock screw, install it through here. This one takes a 5mm hex key. Don't force it. It is easy if you're not paying attention to accidentally strip out the threads in that stud. So don't force anything. Make sure everything's lined up properly before you go to tighten things down. Then we'll do the forward screw. That takes a 3mm. The next thing we'll do is make sure that our breech seal is in place. Just snap it in there. We'll work the breech into its place by sliding the barrel through the barrel band. We'll start this screw here in the back. We'll install the Phillips screw up in the front. I'm going to go ahead and decock the gun here. We'll install the shroud. We'll snug down this grub screw here with our 2mm hex key. It doesn't have to be over torqued. The last thing that we need to do is to install the safety. To do that, we'll want to make sure we have it pointed in the safe position, which means the slot is going to be facing down and away from the plunger. So we're going to use a flathead screwdriver to hold that plunger up, and we're going to push in the safety and back the screwdriver out kind of at the same time. Once you've got it kind of in there, you should be able to just tap it home, just like that. You want to verify that the safety still works. It should flip forward. You should be able to dry fire the gun. In this configuration, it shouldn't fire. We can now gas up the gun, make sure it holds air, and we're complete. All right, now that you've got your regulator installed, there's a couple of points I'd like to bring up. The first one is your pressure gauge now is only going to read the regulator output. So it's not going to tell you the pressure in this side of the air chamber. It's only going to show the output. And so you need to pay attention to this. As you're filling your rifle, you want to look at the gauge on your compressor or your PCP pump. Go with that as far as the fill pressure. You'll notice that this needle will move up until it hits the regulator set point, and then it's going to stop. So pay attention to the gauge on your compressor or your hand pump to know how much pressure you're actually putting into the gun. So then you might have the question, well, how do I know if I'm out of air? Basically what you're going to do is you're going to watch this to fall off the regulator. In other words, when the pressure starts to move down. And what I typically will do is I'll count how many shots it takes for that needle to usually start moving. And I'll know maybe it's 3 magazines. I'll know after 3 magazines I need to refill my gun. And so that's how you keep track of the amount of pressure that's remaining in your gun. You just simply keep track of the number of shots, watch your regulator output. So why would we install a regulator? Well, in an unregulated gun, your air pressure starts out, in this case, at 3,000 psi, and then as you shoot, the pressure drops. And what typically ends up happening is your gun will start out shooting slowly, it will gradually ramp up in speed, and then it'll gradually taper off. And so this can have an effect downrange. If your ammunition is traveling at slower or faster velocities, you'll get what's called vertical stringing. Your shots will kind of string up and down. They should be in line left to right. So what a regulator does is it sets a fixed output pressure. The valve only sees a fixed pressure. In this case, it might be 1800 psi. And so as long as you have over 1800 psi on this side of the regulator, the valve only sees 1800 psi, and that eliminates that vertical stringing in your shooting. And this, in theory, should give you better accuracy. It really makes a big difference as you stretch out how far you're shooting.